former doctor reveals.
Have you ever imagined what it would be like to be between life and death, facing the darkest mysteries of existence? What if I told you that a former doctor, used to saving lives, was led into the underworld of the unknown and came back to report what he saw? Today, you will learn one of the most disturbing and impactful stories I have ever heard. This is not just any story, but a frightening revelation about what happens beyond this life, a dive into the depths of hell and the lost souls that wander in a hospital marked by spiritual torment. Imagine, for a moment, that the tranquility of a hospital bed, where lives should be restored, is replaced by something dark, almost unbelievable. What if the corridors that seem empty at dawn echoed the screams of desperate souls crying out for help that never arrives? Hell, for many, is just a distant concept, a story told to scare children. But what if he was more real than you ever imagined? What if the choices we make here define our eternal destiny? This former doctor's report is more than a testimony. It is a warning. He witnessed torments that defy all human logic, visions of a hospital that has become an extension of hell itself, with souls wandering, trapped in an endless cycle of pain and regret. He was not just an observer. He felt the weight of the revelation, saw the eyes of those who no longer have hope, and heard the accusations of the demons themselves. Do you believe that places like hospitals, where lives are saved and restored, can carry dark spiritual energy? He saw spiritual doors opening and revealing a reality that few dared to believe. What seemed to be a simple medical routine became an invitation to witness the unimaginable. Corridors where light cannot penetrate, shadows that whisper, and a darkness that consumes even the strongest. With every second you listen to this story, more revealing details emerge. Details that show how seemingly small decisions can lead to eternal damnation. This doctor, accustomed to dealing with the physical body, had to confront the spiritual in a brutal way. He realized that hell is not just a place for those who reject salvation, but a destiny that begins to manifest itself here on earth in moments of despair and unbelief. Lost souls, cries of regret, and an overwhelming presence that seemed to watch his every move. This was the reality he faced. And as he searched for answers, the only thing that remained was a constant, desperate question. How can so many people ignore such clear signs about the destiny of their soul? Maybe you felt something strange in places like this, a presence that doesn't seem to belong to this world. Many dismiss it as just imagination, but this report will make you consider. This doctor's revelations are not just about hell itself, but about how it infiltrates our lives subtly, silently, until it's too late. What you are about to hear will change the way you view your own spiritual journey. Prepare yourself for an experience that will shake your soul, because hell, as he saw it, is not only real, it's closer than you think. If something touched your heart when you heard these words, perhaps it is time to stop and reflect on your own spiritual journey. What happened to this former doctor is a clear warning for all of us. And in the face of all this, there is something powerful we can do right now. Pray. Prayer is the bridge that connects us to the divine, an essential tool to seek protection, strength, and guidance in the face of spiritual realities that we often cannot see. In the darkest moments, it is prayer that brings light and hope to our lives. Leave your prayer request in the comments. It could be for you, for someone in your family, for a friend, or for any situation that is weighing on your heart. Let's pray together, because where two or more are united in prayer, extraordinary things happen. The power of prayer goes beyond what we can imagine. It is an act of faith that breaks barriers and reaches heaven. And if this content is touching you in some way, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This helps us bring this important message to even more people who need to hear about God's love, the power of prayer, and the spiritual realities we often ignore. Share this video with anyone you believe needs to hear this story, because together we can reach souls and spread hope. It was just another seemingly ordinary night in the hospital, The early morning silence, occasionally broken by the sounds of heart monitors and nurses' hurried footsteps, conveyed false sense of normality. But to that doctor, something seemed out of place. At first, he couldn't identify what it was, but a strange feeling had been with him for weeks. It was as if a shadow hung over him, something that was not part of the frantic routine of saving lives. That initial discomfort was the beginning of a supernatural calling that he would never forget. He clearly remembered the day it all started. He was sitting in his office, reviewing medical records, when suddenly an icy sensation took over the room. It wasn't just cold. It was as if the air had been sucked out, leaving an unsettling void. The noise from the corridors diminished, and for a few seconds, he had the impression that he was alone, even though he knew the hospital was open. It was at that moment that a whispered, almost inaudible, voice seemed to come from inside the room. "They are here." He looked around, looking for a logical explanation, but nothing seemed to make sense. He tried to ignore the event, attributing it to extreme tiredness from exhausting shift. But the feelings began to intensify. The following night, while making rounds, the doctor noticed something even stranger. Passing through one of the hospital's less busy corridors, he felt a presence. It was not someone who could be seen, but something that could be felt. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy that was difficult to describe. The doctor stopped and looked around. The hallway was empty. Still, he felt like he was being watched. That same week, the experiences began to gain intensity. During an emergency in the operating room, he saw something in the corner of the room that made him freeze for a few seconds. It was a shadow, but not an ordinary shadow. She seemed to have her own shape, almost human, and watched the procedure as if she were waiting for something. He blinked, and the figure disappeared. Still, he couldn't get that image out of his head. All of this began to eat away at his sanity, as he was a skeptical man, used to dealing with what was concrete, palpable, and explainable. But these occurrences were beyond any logic or science, he knew. As the days went by, the demonstrations increased. I heard low, indistinct voices, as if several people were murmuring at the same time. One day, as he passed an empty ward, he heard someone call his name. It was a clear whisper, filled with despair. When he entered the room, he found only empty beds and an open window. He closed his eyes for a moment and tried to shake the feeling away, but he knew something was trying to get his attention. And it was at that moment that he began to wonder, why him? Why were these things happening to him? Someone so devoted to science and logic? That same week, a nurse reported to him that she also felt something strange in the same corridors where he had had his experiences. "Doctor, sometimes it seems like someone is walking around here, but when I look, there is no one." That was enough to convince him that what was happening was not the result of his mind. Other people were feeling it too. Something supernatural was manifesting in that hospital, and he was right in the center of it all. As he tried to maintain his routine, the nights became increasingly challenging. The shadows that were once at the edges of his vision began to seem closer. One day, he heard a sigh next to him, as if someone was standing right next to him. When he looked, there was nothing. But the smell that lingered in the air was something he had never smelled before. A sulfury, burnt odor, as if something had been brought from a place that did not belong to this world. The culmination of this initial phase occurred on a rainy morning. He was in the break room, trying to regain his strength after a long procedure, when, once again, he felt the air change. This time, it was different. There was not just a sensation, but a real, oppressive presence. He couldn't move, as if something invisible was pressing against his chest. It was then that he heard a voice, clearer than ever, saying, "You can't save everyone. Many are already yours." He stood up, fighting the fear and weight he felt, but the presence seemed to intensify, laughing as he tried to pray silently. That was the moment he realized he couldn't ignore what was happening. Something had changed, not just in the hospital, but in his life. He was chosen to see things no one else saw, to feel reality no one else felt. And what he began to understand was that what was happening went far beyond the hospital wall. It was a calling, a forced invitation to see the spiritual realities that so many choose to ignore. But what he saw after that moment was even more terrifying. The lost souls he would encounter, the dark secrets that would be revealed, and the direct confrontation with forces from hell were just beginning. He knew his life would never be the same, but he also knew he couldn't keep what he was witnessing to himself. And this is where this story really begins. After that first moment when something seemed to change forever, he felt that the hospital routine would never be the same again. The corridors, previously just a space for constant movement between wings and rooms, began to carry an oppressive presence. It wasn't just the tiredness of the shifts that made him feel this way. It was as if the walls were permeated with something invisible, something that little by little began to manifest itself in a disturbing way. He knew something was about to happen, but he had no idea what awaited him. The first clear vision came on a stormy night. The electrical power fluctuated, leaving the hospital in an unsettling darkness. During one round, he found himself standing in the middle of a hallway that seemed emptier and quieter than usual. Something caught his attention in the background, an almost imperceptible movement. He blinked a few times, believing it was just the flashing light. But when he fixed his eyes, he noticed something that made him freeze. A figure was there, standing, still. It wasn't a patient, it wasn't a colleague, and it certainly wasn't an ordinary shadow. It had form, but its presence was felt more than seen. When he tried to get closer, the figure disappeared, but the weight of that vision remained with him days later. During a shift that seemed to drag on for hours because it was so slow, he again noticed strange movements in the corridor. In the distance, he saw shapes pass quickly, like figures that hid before he could identify them. But the worst wasn't what he saw, it was what he felt. A constant presence, as if he was being watched closely. Every step seemed charged with a tension he couldn't describe. He avoided looking at the corners of the hallway, as if he knew something would be there if he looked too long. That feeling began to intensify in an alarming way. One morning, as he passed through the emergency ward, he heard a sound that made him stop immediately. It sounded like a child crying, but there were no children in that ward. The sound was coming from an empty room at the end of the hallway. He hesitated, but his curiosity was stronger. When he arrived at the room, he found the bed empty, and the sound simply stopped. However, one thing caught his attention: the mirror. On the wall appeared to have fingerprints on it, as if someone had pressed their hands against it. He touched the glass, but it was cold as ice. Little by little, the visions began to become clearer and more frightening. One night, while resting in his living room, he was overcome by an inexplicable feeling of sleepiness, as if he were forced to sleep. As soon as he closed his eyes, he saw a familiar hallway, but it was empty and dark. The walls seemed to close him in, and the shadows moved, as if they had a life of their own. He tried to wake up, but he seemed stuck in that place. Suddenly, he saw something coming towards him. It was a hooded figure, faceless, but with a presence that emanated pure despair. He woke up sweating, with rapid breathing, and saw that his clock read 3:33 in the morning. From that moment on, he knew that this was no longer confined to the hospital corridor. Whatever it was starting to follow him. He started hearing whispers, even when he was outside the work area. Indistinct words, but always filled with anguish. Sometimes it seemed like the voices were saying things like, "Help me," or "There's no way out." He began to question his own sanity, but deep down, he knew this wasn't just a figment of his imagination. The hospital, a place he once saw as a home of healing and renewal, now seemed like a portal to something much bigger and darker. The energy he felt in the hallways was almost palpable. Certain areas seemed to be worse than others. He avoided going through their recovery ward alone because he always felt like someone was walking behind him. One night, he had the courage to quickly turn around, only to stare into space. But even so, he felt heavy breathing next to him, as if something was there, hidden in the shadows. One of the most memorable experiences happened during an emergency procedure. A patient was being resuscitated after a cardiac arrest. As he and the team fought to save that person's life, the doctor had the impression that there was someone else in the room. I wasn't a member of the team. It was something beyond what the eyes could see. He felt that that presence was there to take the patient's soul. The air felt heavier. Time seemed to slow down, and he tried even harder, almost as if he was competing with that invisible force. When the patient was stabilized, he felt the presence move away, but knew it had not completely gone away. These events continued to accumulate, creating an almost unbearable tension. He knew he was seeing something that many would prefer to ignore, something that could completely change the way he saw the world. The hospital corridors, with their shadows and inexplicable sounds, were just the beginning of a deep dive into something that went far beyond his understanding. Each night, he wondered what else would be revealed. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had an experience where you felt like you were being watched, even though you were alone? Have you ever seen or felt something that you can't explain? Comment below and share with me. Write "I believe" if you have felt something similar, or "I need to know more" to continue following this story. This is important because each comment helps to spread this message to more people. I want to hear your experiences. The days became heavier, and the nights a true test of courage. Every time the doctor walked through the hospital corridors, the feeling that he was not alone intensified. However, what previously seemed like just an invisible presence now began to reveal itself in a more frightening way. He began to realize that the shadows in the corners of the hallways were not just reflections of dim lighting or tiredness. They had shape, and some seemed to be there for specific reason. It was at this moment that he had his first direct contact with what he would later describe as lost soul. It all happened in a silent dawn. While making routine rounds, he passed by an almost deserted wing of the hospital, where few patients were admitted. At the end of the hall, a figure sat in a chair, his head lowered. At first, he thought it was a patient, or even someone accompanying him. He approached slowly, drawing the person's attention with a calm tone of voice. But the figure did not react. As he got closer, he noticed something strange. That person's skin looked too pale, almost translucent. And then, when he was just a few steps away, the figure raised its head. What he saw paralyzed. That face was not human. There was something deeply wrong, as if he were disfigured by pain or despair. The eyes were dull, but seemed to silently scream for help. Before he could react, the figure simply disappeared before his eyes, like a mist dissipating into thin air. He remained motionless for a few seconds, trying to understand what had just happened. It was the first time that something so clear and so close had happened. And, even though he was a rational man, he knew that it was not a figment of his imagination. After this encounter, he began to notice that lost souls didn't just wander around the hospital. They seemed to be trapped in a never-ending cycle of suffering. One day, while passing through the same corridor where he had his first vision, he heard whispers. They were voices full of despair, and one of them said repeatedly, "Why me? Why did this happen, Tom?" The voice seemed to come from a room that, to his surprise, was empty when he entered. But the cold in the room was so intense that he felt as if he had stepped through a portal to another place. Time seemed to slow down, and he could barely breathe. Even without seeing anything, he knew that those souls were there, watching everything. The meetings began to become more and more frequent. On a particularly difficult night, he came across a figure who seemed trapped between two worlds. It was a woman, her clothes stained with blood, who looked directly at him. His eyes conveyed a mixture of fear and guilt. "Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice weak and full of regret. The doctor was speechless, unable to respond. Before she could say anything, she started crying. Her tears fell to the ground, but disappeared before touching the surface, as if they were made of something ethereal. And, just like the first figure he saw, it disappeared. From these experiences, he began to notice a pattern. Many of these souls were trapped by traumatic events, often hospital-related. Some seemed to constantly relive the moment of their deaths, while others were searching for answers or redemption. He began to understand that these spirits were not there by chance. They were trying to communicate, trying to find relief from their pain. And somehow he was able to feel and see what other people couldn't. One of the most memorable moments happened when he entered an operating room that was empty at the time. As soon as he crossed the door, he felt an inexplicable pressure, as if he were entering an environment charged with negative energy. In the center of the room, he saw a man kneeling, with his hands covering his face. He seemed to be crying, muttering something like, I didn't know it would be like this." The doctor tried to get closer, but before he could take another step, the figure raised its head, revealing a look that he would never forget. There was such a deep emptiness in the man's eyes that it seemed to pull him in. And then the man said, "Warn them. Tell them not to make the same mistakes." Those words echoed in the doctor's mind for days. He began to understand that these souls were not just trapped in the hospital. They were in a state of eternal torment, unable to move forward. Many of them seemed to want to convey a message, a warning to the living. It was as if they were begging for no one else to follow the same path as them. He knew he needed to pay attention, but at the same time, he felt the weight of carrying these revelations. These encounters left a deep impression on him, and he began to reflect on what it all meant. Was the hospital a type of portal, a place where souls could not find rest? Or would he be chosen to witness these things for some greater reason? Each time he saw a new soul or heard a new whisper, he felt more connected to this spiritual reality, but also more scared of what might yet be to come. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like something or someone was trying to send you a message, even without words? Comment, "I've felt this," or "I want to understand more," and share your experience. The more people get involved, the more stories we can bring to light. Let's talk. Events at the hospital began to escalate in a way that challenged any notion of reality he possessed. The doctor, who previously lived trapped in what was tangible and explainable, was now a man marked by encounters with the inexplicable. But nothing prepared him for what he was about to experience. The hospital, which seemed to be just a place of work, a space where lives were saved or, in some cases, lost, turned out to be something much more sinister. It was as if that place was a connection point between two worlds, the visible and the spiritual. And that night, he would be brought to a level of understanding he had never imagined. It all started when he was called to respond to an emergency. A patient in critical condition was being transferred to the ICU, and he needed to supervise the procedure. The ride to the ICU seemed longer than usual, as if the hallway was stretching before your eyes. The lighting flickered, casting shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own. He breathed deeply, trying to stay focused on what he needed to do, but something inside him told him that tonight would be different. When he arrived at the ICU, he felt pressure in his chest, as if the air around him had changed. It was heavier, almost suffocating. As the team attempted to stabilize the patient, he positioned himself next to the bed, monitoring vital signs and giving quick instruction. But suddenly, the environment around him seemed to freeze. Everything was silent. The monitors, the sounds of the machines, even the breathing of the other doctor in the room, everything stopped. He looked around, but no one seemed to notice what was happening. It was as if he was trapped in an instant, displaced from time and space. And it was then that he felt something he had never felt before, an overwhelming presence that filled the entire environment. When he looked up, he saw something that shouldn't be there. In the corner of the room, a tall, dark figure emerged from the shadow. She wasn't human. Its shape was distorted, with contours that seemed to change every second. Bright eyes stared at him, and a cruel smile formed where the mouth should have been. The figure spoke, but the voice did not come as an ordinary sound. It was as if the words were being poured directly into his mind, each syllable charged with malice. "You see it now, don't you? This place belongs to us, and Manyar already." Here, without even realizing it, he felt his body paralyze as if it was impossible to move a muscle. The figure took a step forward, and the surroundings seemed to darken even more. Behind her, he saw something even more terrifying, what appeared to be a portal. It wasn't something physical, but he could feel its energy. It was a whirlwind of darkness and fire, and from it screams emanated that seemed to echo from an infinite distance. He knew, without anyone having to tell him, that this was a vision of hell, a place of torment and despair beyond earthly description. The portal pulsed as if it were alive, and within it, he saw scenes that will never leave his memory. People being consumed by flames, chains trapping souls that screamed for mercy, and creatures that seemed to feed on the pain of those who were there. He realized that some of the figures he saw in the portal were familiar, faces of people he had previously treated at the hospital, patients who had died under his care. The shock was so great that he almost fell to the ground, but the shadowy figure in front of him seemed to delight in his terror. "You think you save lives, but you don't see what happens beyond that," said the entity, with a voice full of mockery. "They come here one by one, and there is nothing you can do to stop them. You see only the body. We see the soul." Those words pierced his mind like blades, each one carrying a bitter truth that he didn't want to accept. He began to wonder how many of those who had passed through his hands could be in that place. How many were stuck in that cycle of torment because they never had the chance to understand the spiritual choices that awaited them. At that moment, he tried to pray. He didn't know exactly what to say, but in his mind, he began to cry out for help. It was an almost instinctive gesture, but it was enough for something to change. A light, faint at first, began to form behind the shadowy figure. It grew slowly, like a dawn, dispelling the darkness around it. The figure began to twitch, as if the light was unbearable. The screams from the portal grew louder, but he realized they weren't from pain. They were from something trying to break free. As the light filled the room, he felt an inexplicable peace. The portal disappeared, and the shadowy figure retreated, disappearing along with the darkness. He fell to his knees, feeling as if he had been ripped from a nightmare. But he knew that it hadn't been just a vision. It was a revelation, a chance to see what most people ignore. And more than that, it was a call to something bigger. Now I want to know, have you ever felt like there are things beyond what we can see? Comment here if you believe that the spiritual world is closer than we imagine. Write, "I believe in the invisible," or "I want to understand more about this," to show that you are also looking for answers. Let's talk about what lies beyond the reality we know. After the light dispelled the darkness of that terrible vision, the doctor remained kneeling on the ICU floor, breathing unevenly, trying to regain control of his body. The feeling of relief that the presence of the light had brought was quickly replaced by an even greater uneasiness. He knew that this spiritual battle was far from over. What he witnessed was just a glimpse of something much deeper, and he was beginning to understand that there were evil forces that not only operated in the unseen, but also had a direct interest in the souls that passed through the hospital. The revelations would continue, but this time, they wouldn't just be visions. He would hear, clearly and directly, the messages from the demons that inhabited that place. The following night, he returned to the hospital with the feeling that something was about to happen. It was as if that place, which he knew so well, had transformed into an unknown territory, full of traps and hidden presences. As I walked through the halls, everything felt heavier. The light seemed dimmer, the sounds more muffled. He felt like he was being led towards something, as if the steps he took were not completely his own, but guided by an invisible force. As he entered an empty room, a shiver ran down his spine. He knew he wasn't alone, but this time the presence he felt no longer hid in the shadows. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to talk. It was at that moment that he heard the first voice. It didn't come from outside, but seemed to echo directly in his mind. It was serious, hoarse, and each word carried a weight that seemed to pierce your soul. "You think you can save them, but they are already ours." He looked around, looking for the source of that voice, but he knew there was no one there but him. The room seemed to spin, and he felt the floor shake slightly. Then a second voice joined the first, sharper and more mocking. They all, from the first to the last, gave themselves to us without resistance. And you, what will you do? Do you think you can change anything? The doctor felt his heart speed up. He knew he was being confronted by something far beyond his understanding, but he needed to maintain control. He took a deep breath, trying to muster the courage to react. That was when a third voice, more subtle, almost whispered, echoed, "We are everywhere. You saw us. You know. You cannot escape what has already begun." It was as if those entities were playing with him, challenging him, testing the limits of his sanity and his faith. The words not only scared him, but they also carried a strange sense of truth, as if they were trying to convince him that the world was hopelessly lost. He tried to focus on silent prayers, but every word seemed to be interrupted by muffled laughter, coming from all directions. The voices began to speak simultaneously, creating chaos that seemed impossible to bear. They chose this. Each of them chose darkness. There is no salvation for those who already belong to us. These words were accompanied by flashes of images that appeared in his mind. He saw faces, patients who had passed through the hospital, people he recognized, but the faces were distorted, marked by expressions of despair and torment. He realized that this wasn't just a tease. It was an attempt to show that the fate of those souls had already been sealed. Those entities weren't just there to intimidate him. They had a clear objective: to plant doubt. They wanted him to believe that all efforts were useless, that the souls he was trying to save in the physical world were already condemned in the spiritual world. But there was something darker in their words, an insinuation that he himself was being watched, that his choices would also be put to the test. One of the voices stood out from the rest and said something that stuck in his mind. "You are also on the scale, and you know you can't hide." Those words hit him in a different way. He began to question his own action, his own thoughts. Was there anything he had done or failed to do that could have put him at risk? Could it be that he was also vulnerable to the traps that these evil forces prepared? Doubt began to creep into his mind, and he felt like he was losing control. But deep down, he knew he couldn't give in. He needed to fight that influence, even if it seemed impossible. It was in this moment of deep anguish that he remembered the light that had appeared the night before. He focused his mind on the image of that light, trying to cling to it like a shipwrecked man clinging to a piece of wood. Slowly, the voices began to die down. The whispers dissipated, and the environment around him returned to normal. He was still shaking, but something inside him had changed. He realized that these messages were not just threats, but also a revelation of how these forces operated. They fed on fear, doubt, and hopelessness. And he knew that, to face them, he would need to strengthen his faith and courage. Now, I want you to tell me, have you ever felt like you were being tested by something bigger? Something that wanted to make you give up? Right here in the comment, "I resist," or "I need strength," to show that you are not alone. Share your experience, because each story is a reminder that even in darkness, there is light for those who seek. Let's continue on this journey together. When the voices finally stopped and the environment around the doctor returned to what seemed like normal, he realized that despite the momentary relief, something profound had changed. The messages the demon had given him echoed in his mind like repetitive, disturbing music. "They are already ours." These words seemed to have been engraved in his soul, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more than these entities were willing to reveal. Why were they so eager to declare ownership over so many souls? Why did those presences seem so determined to sow fear? And more importantly, why was being chosen to witness all of this? As the days went by, he began to notice patterns in everything that was happening. It wasn't just the visions or the voices. There was a constant flow of signs, of seemingly small moments that seemed charged with meaning. Patients who arrived at the hospital in critical condition often said strange things before losing consciousness. or during episodes of delirium. Some of these words directly echoed what he had heard during his supernatural experience. Phrases like, "They are taking me," "I see fire," or "I wasn't warned in time," began to become common. Each of these statements was a reminder that what he had witnessed was not just a matter of his own mind or his own fear, but something real, something that was connected to these people's lives and choices. One night, as he was reviewing the records of patients who had recently died at the hospital, something caught his attention. He noticed that many of these patients had something in common. Their stories were marked by deep regrets, feelings of guilt, and an almost absolute distancing from spirituality in their lives. They were people who, apparently, carried an inner emptiness so great that, when they reached their limit, they could not find any strength to fight. He began to wonder if this pattern was a fluke or if it was part of something bigger, something that the voices he had heard were trying to explain, however perversely and maliciously. It was in one of these moments of reflection that he began to realize the true meaning of the messages he had received. The entities that confronted him seemed determined to convey a terrifying truth. Humanity was moving further and further from the light and heading quickly toward darkness. Desperation, indifference, and lack of spiritual connection were weapons evil forces were using to conquer soul. And as terrifying as it was to accept this, he knew he was seeing the evidence every day in his work. People arrived at the hospital not only with their bodies sick, but with their souls completely helpless. He also began to reflect on something the demons had said during that encounter. "We are everywhere." This phrase resonated like a warning, a reminder that the spiritual battle was not just fought in moments of despair or in the face of death, but in every decision, in every seemingly insignificant choice that people made in their daily lives. He began to observe more closely how the behaviors and attitudes of the people around him seemed to open doors to these evil influences. Arrogance, greed, unresolved anger, and even obsession with worldly distraction seemed to be small invitations for these forces to come closer. It was as if humanity was gradually ceding its spiritual territory, handing over pieces of itself to these entities without realizing the price they would pay. One day, as he walked down the hall toward the hospital chapel, a place he had rarely visited. Until then, he was overcome by a sense of urgency. It was as if something was pulling him to that place, as if he needed to seek answers, or at least comfort. Upon entering, he found the place empty, but he felt a peace that he hadn't experienced since it all began. He knelt before the altar, something he hadn't done in years, and tried to pray. But instead of words, what came was a deep feeling of guilt and regret. He began to cry, as if all the weight of the things he had witnessed was being released in that moment. It was at that moment that he felt, for the first time, something that he could describe as an answer. It was not a voice like that of demon, but a serene presence that seemed to say, "You saw, so you can warn them." This experience filled him with determination, but also with fear. He knew it wouldn't be easy to share what he had experienced. Many people wouldn't believe him. Some might even ridicule him, but he also knew he had no choice. Each night, as he walked the hospital hallways, he saw signs of the same spiritual battles he had so intensely witnessed. He began to wonder, what if more people were experiencing these struggles without realizing it? What if many of those souls he saw in torment had had the chance to change the course of their lives, but ignored the warning? He understood that, more than ever, he needed to do something to alert people. He needed to tell what he saw, what he heard, and, most importantly, what those forces were saying about the fate of so many. This wasn't just about him or the hospital, it was about all of us, about the choices we make every day, about how each decision can take us closer to the light or deeper into the darkness. Now I want to hear you. Have you ever felt like something in your life was a warning, a chance to change direction before it was too late? Comment here, "I heard the warning," or "I need answers," so that we can reflect together on the signs we receive. Remember, every comment is a way to spread this message and reach more people. Let's continue on this journey together. After so many nights marked by dark encounters and terrifying messages, the doctor began to feel exhausted. as if his energy was slowly being drained. Each experience made him more aware of the spiritual reality that surrounded him, but also more vulnerable to the emotional and physical toll of it all. He found himself constantly questioning his sanity and his faith, trying to understand why he was being exposed to something so intense, disturbing. But it was in the midst of this growing despair that he would experience one of the most impactful moments of his entire journey, a divine rescue that he never imagined he would witness. The night began like so many others, with him trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy while tending to patients. But throughout the shift, he noticed that something was different. The hospital seemed even quieter than usual, as if the world around him had slowed down. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something much bigger was about to happen. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the tasks at hand, but the feeling only grew. Every step he took seemed to echo louder. Every hallway he crossed seemed longer. He felt like he was being guided, but he didn't know exactly where. It was during one round that everything began to reveal itself. As he passed through the emergency ward, he heard a peculiar sound, something between a murmur and a whine. He stopped, looked around, and realized the sound was coming from one of the empty rooms. For a moment, he thought about ignoring it, but something compelled him to enter. As soon as he walked through the door, the air around him seemed to change. The temperature dropped drastically, and the feeling of oppression he already knew returned with full force. He knew he was facing yet another demonstration, but what happened next was far beyond what he expected. In the corner of the room, a figure began to form. At first it was just a shadow, but little by little, it took shape. It was a tall, imposing presence, but at the same time, terrifying. His eyes shone with a light that seemed to come from the depths of something indescribable. She stared at him for a few seconds before starting to move towards him. The doctor tried to step back, but his feet seemed stuck to the floor. He felt an intense cold run through his body, and, for the first time, he realized that he was completely powerless in the face of that force. The figure spoke, but its words were not like the voices he had heard before. There was no scorn or mockery. There was authority, but a distorted authority, loaded with threats. "You can't escape. Your soul has already been marked." Those words hit him like a blow, filling him with dread. He tried to react. He tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come out. It was as if something was suffocating him, preventing him from fighting. He felt his strength slipping away, and for a moment he thought this would be the end, but it was at that moment, at the height of his despair, that something extraordinary happened. A light began to appear in the room, faint at first, but quickly growing in intensity. It was unlike any light he had ever seen. It wasn't just visible, it was something he could feel. It was warm, comforting, and most of all, powerful. The shadowy figure in front of him immediately retreated, as if he could not bear the presence of that light. The doctor fell to his knees, feeling enveloped by a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. In the center of that light, a figure began to form. He couldn't see clear details, but he knew in his heart that he was looking at something divine. It wasn't just a vision, it was a real, palpable presence. The voice he heard next was not like the others. She was serene, but full of authority. It was as if every word was filled with love and justice at the same time. "You were chosen to see, to feel, to understand. But don't be afraid, I am with you." Those words penetrated his soul in a way he didn't know was possible. It was as if every part of her being was being restored, healed, strengthened. The light continued to grow, filling the entire room. He saw the shadowy figure disappear completely, as if it had never been there. But the impact of that experience remained. He felt tears streaming down his face, not from fear, but from relief and gratitude. For the first time in weeks, he felt that he was not alone, that there was something or someone much greater watching over him and guiding him through this darkness. He knew there was still a lot to face, but now he had a certainty that would sustain him. He was being protected. When everything returned to normal, he stood up, still shaking, but with a new determination. He knew this experience wasn't just for him. It was a reminder that even in the darkest situations, there is a light that can never be turned off. He realized his mission was to share this with as many people as possible, because what he had experienced was not just a revelation, it was a call to warn, to strengthen, and to guide. And now, I ask you, have you ever felt that, even in the most difficult moment, there was something or someone looking out for you? Comment, "I believe in light," or "I need this strength to share your experience." Your words can inspire others to find hope and courage. Let's spread this message together. After encountering that divine light, the doctor realized that not only had he been rescued, but also called to see the world in a completely different way. He had received a glimpse of something that many people spend their entire lives ignoring: the spiritual reality that permeates every aspect of existence. Before that, he believed that his responsibility was limited to the physical, the human body, diagnoses, and treatment. Now he understood that there was an invisible world, as real as the one he could see and touch, and that this world profoundly influenced people's choices, paths, and destinies. He began to reflect on the revelations he had received and the way they connected to human behavior. One of the messages that impacted him most during his experiences was how small, everyday attitudes could open doors to spiritual forces that often went unnoticed. It was easy to imagine that great things were necessary to attract evil, but he learned that this was not the case. Pride, greed, resentment, indifference, all these feelings that seemed harmless in everyday life were, in fact, subtle invitations for dark forces to approach. And the scary thing was that these forces didn't need much to start acting. They grew in silence, in spiritual neglect, and grew stronger where the light of faith was not cultivated. He started paying attention to the people around him. I noticed how despair and lack of purpose were almost a pattern in many of those who entered the hospital. People arrived filled with anguish, as if something other than their physical illnesses were consuming them. It was as if their bodies reflected what their souls were experiencing, an internal collapse, their result of choices that, over time, took them away from what could restore them. The doctor understood that his mission was now much broader than saving bodies. He needed to help these people see the truth about their spiritual lives. One night, while watching the monitor of a critically ill patient, he remembered something he'd heard during his encounter with the divine presence. A simple sentence, but one that now made perfect sense. What you see here is a reflection of what they already experience inside. He began to reflect on how so many people spend their lives chasing fleeting things, status, power, momentary pleasures, and, in the process, forget to feed what really matters, their souls. And the price for that was high. The emptiness he saw in the eyes of many patients was a silent testimony to lives lived without purpose, without connection, without a spiritual foundation. But he also knew there was hope. That light he had experienced in the darkest moment of his life was proof that no one was completely lost, as long as they were willing to seek the truth. He began to realize that his experience had not just been a sequence of terrifying events, but a call to action. He had been chosen to be a voice amidst the chaos, a reminder that the spiritual world not only exists, but also directly influences what happens in the physical world, and he knew he needed to share it. The doctor also began to reflect on how many people lived in fear of the unknown, fear of the future, fear of failure. He realized that this fear was one of the most powerful weapons used by dark forces to keep people trapped. Fear paralyzed, made them doubt, and above all, kept them away from what could free them. He understood now that the antidote to this fear was faith. Not just a vague belief, but an unshakable confidence that, even in the worst situations, there was a greater light that would never stop shining. During his reflections, he also began to question his own choices. He realized that, even though he was someone focused on saving lives, he had often neglected what was most important. He remembered patients who passed through his hands, people who perhaps needed more than just medical treatment. Maybe they needed words of comfort, someone to say there was still hope. He felt the weight of lost opportunities, but at the same time, he found a renewal in his purpose. He understood that there was still time to make a difference, to plant seeds of light where there was once darkness. What impacted him most, however, was the idea that many people had no idea how vulnerable they were. He knew he needed to warn them. He needed to tell them what he had seen and what he had learned. He needed to show that spiritual warfare was real and that no one was exempt from it. But he also knew he needed to do it with love, because fear alone was not enough to transform lives. He wanted people to understand that light was accessible to everyone, but it was necessary to seek it. It was necessary to make space for it to enter. Now I ask you, have you ever stopped to think about how your daily choices could be shaping your spiritual future? Right here in the comment, I choose light, or I want to understand more so we can continue this conversation. Your participation is important because this is how we help more people see what really matters. Let's transform our lives together and spread this message. After everything he experienced, the doctor was no longer the same person. Something inside him had changed forever. He no longer saw his profession as just a job that involved saving bodies and diagnosing illnesses. He now understood that there was something much deeper in each person who came into his care. Every face, every name in a medical record carried a story, a soul that was often in a silent battle between light and dark. He knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. His experiences had not been in vain, and he felt he was being called to something much greater than he could understand. The weight of the revelations he had received was something he carried every day. He still had moments of doubt and even fear. But now, there was something different, a certainty. Heck knew that that light that rescued him in the darkest moment of his life would never leave him. He started looking for ways to share this with others, but realized not everyone was ready to listen. Many were so distracted by everyday problems that they were unable to see beyond what was in front of their eyes. This worried him because he knew what happened to those who ignored spiritual signs. He had seen the despair of lost souls, and those images remained vivid in his memory, like a constant warning. In his daily life, he began to adopt a different approach with his patients. He understood that he couldn't force anyone to believe what he had seen, but he could plant small seeds of hope. He began to listen more, to connect more deeply with each person who crossed his path. Sometimes he just offered words of comfort. Other times, he felt he should pray for someone, even if it was silent. There were times when he saw tears stream down the faces of people who were in complete despair. And on each of those occasions, he realized the impact that his presence, his faith, and his compassion could have. One night, he was called to see a patient who had just suffered a serious accident. The man was conscious, but visibly shaken, with tears in his eyes and words that came out in sobs. "You should have died today," he said. The doctor approached, held the man's hand, and said something he had never said before. "You are not here by chance. Maybe today you were spared because someone wants you to understand that your life has purpose." The man looked at him with surprise, and after a moment of silence, he began to cry even more. At that moment, the doctor felt that he had touched something very deep. It was as if he was fulfilling part of his mission. But this transformation did not come without challenges. He faced many doubts from those close to him. Some co-workers began to notice changes in his behavior and questioned what was happening. Some even mocked him, saying he seemed to be going too far in his search for meaning. But he didn't care. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had faced. And most of all, he knew that his mission was greater than any criticism or judgment. He understood that he was in a constant spiritual battle, but now he was no longer fighting alone. He also began to reflect on his own life, on the times when he had strayed from what really mattered. He remembered situations in which he had prioritized work or material matters above his own spirituality. He realized that, in many moments, he himself had opened doors to fear, pride, and indifference. But now, he was determined to change. Each day was an opportunity to start over, to align with that light that had saved him, and to help others find the same path. The experiences he had had made him more sensitive to the spiritual battles around him. He came to see how discouragement, hopelessness, and spiritual emptiness affected people in invisible but powerful ways, and he knew that even in the face of all this, there was something greater, something that could overcome any darkness. He saw this in his own life, and now he wanted to be a living witness to others. It didn't matter if he needed to tell history to dozens or just one person. He would do it. He knew that sometimes a single word of encouragement could change an entire life. Now, he dedicated himself to living more intentionally, more connected to his mission, and knew he would still face challenges that the dark forces wouldn't give up so easily. But no, he was prepared. He had learned the importance of keeping his faith firm, of continuing to seek the light, even in the most difficult time. He also knew that this was a journey that could not be taken alone. He needed community, people who shared the same vision, while were willing to fight the darkness and spread hope. And now I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like your life was being transformed in a way that you couldn't explain? That something greater was calling you to a different purpose? Write here in the comments, "I accept the call," or "I want to be a light," and share your experience. Your words could be the inspiration someone needs to take the first step on their own journey. Let's make this transformation happen together. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this video touched your heart in a special way. These stories, these revelations, and the warnings shared are not just words, but a call to reflect on our choices and seek something greater. Now, I want to hear from you. How did this message speak to your soul? How has it impacted the way you view your life and spiritual journey? I invite you to leave the sentence in the comments. I felt God's voice in this video. Share how this message found its way to you. And, if you want, share a little of your story. Your words will not only be a testimony to others, but they will also help us bring this message of hope and transformation to even more people who need to hear it. If this content touched your heart, I also want to ask you not to leave without leaving your like, because it helps us reach more lives and spread this important message. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, I invite you to subscribe right now. Here, we share content that not only inspires, but also transforms, bringing light and clarity to spiritual questions that we so often ignore. And don't stop here. Our next video is already on the final screen, waiting for you. It's another opportunity to reflect, learn, and strengthen your faith. God has something powerful to speak to your heart, and I believe you were brought here for a greater purpose. May God abundantly bless your life and give you strength to continue your journey, guided by light and truth. Thank you very much for being with us until now, for listening, for reflecting, and for being part of this mission. See you in the next video.